Duchess of York could be seeking a nice pension from the monarchy to keep private matters behind palace walls.
Sarah Ferguson had spent weeks convincing herself that she could still solve everything on her own. Every morning she woke believing there had to be another way forward. Every evening that confidence faded a little more. By the time the snow began falling across the Austrian Alps, she had reached a painful conclusion. The situation had grown beyond her control, and the only people she believed might still stand beside her were the two daughters she had spent her entire life protecting. Late one evening, long after the lights had disappeared from the nearby villages, two identical messages left her phone within seconds of each other. First, she immediately sensed something wasn't right. Normally, Sarah greeted her daughters with warmth, laughter, and endless conversation. This time she barely smiled. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Several untouched cups of tea sat scattered across the sitting room. Stacks of newspapers lay folded on a nearby table, their headlines hidden from view as though she couldn't bear to read them again. Before either woman could speak, another vehicle slowly climbed the icy driveway. Eugenie had arrived. The sisters embraced one another, exchanging the sort of nervous smile shared continued falling peacefully. Inside, every heartbeat seemed louder than before. Sarah admitted she had never felt so uncertain about the future. For years she had managed to survive difficult periods by believing that eventually circumstances would improve. Now, she wasn't so sure. She described feeling increasingly isolated. Conversations that once happened freely had become shorter. Doors that once opened easily now seemed firmly closed. She wasn't simply worried about public opinion. She feared becoming completely disconnected from the family she still considered her own. Beatrice listened carefully, trying to separate emotion from reality. Her mother had always faced criticism with remarkable resilience. Seeing that confidence replaced by genuine uncertainty unsettled her deeply. Eugenie noticed something else. It wasn't fear she saw in Sarah. It was exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly over months rather than days. "What happened?" Eugenie finally asked. Sarah hesitated. "There isn't one single moment," she replied quietly. "It's everything together." She described the constant pressure of public speculation. Every appearance generated new headlines. Every rumour produced fresh commentary. Every attempt to move forward seemed to drag another chapter of the past back into public discussion. The emotional weight had become impossible to ignore. Neither daughter immediately offered advice. Instead, they allowed. Now the roles had quietly reversed. The conversation gradually shifted from emotion to difficult possibilities. Sarah explained that several options had been suggested to her by people outside the family. Some believed she should tell her own story publicly. Others encouraged her to distance herself completely from royal life. Still, others argued she should simply remain silent and hope public attention eventually faded. None of those choices felt right. Each seemed capable of creating even greater divisions. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "I only know I couldn't make this decision without speaking to both of you." Beatrice slowly leaned back in her chair. She understood immediately that this wasn't simply about one interview, one book, or one decision. It was about trust. Whatever period of intense scrutiny, every question seemed more complicated than the last. Neither sister felt ready to answer. Both understood that their own lives would inevitably become part of whatever decision their mother made. Outside the lodge, darkness settled across the mountains. Inside, uncertainty only deepened. Neither Beatrice nor Eugenie had expected their quiet visit to become a turning point. Yet as the hours passed, one realization became impossible to ignore. This gathering wasn't about revisiting the past. It was about deciding how much of the future they were willing to risk for the person who had always stood beside them. Before anyone could reach a conclusion, another unexpected complication was quietly beginning hundreds of miles away. Within palace walls, word had already started circulating that the York sisters had vanished from public view at exactly the same time. Questions were beginning to spread, and before long, someone would want answers. There have been conversations about writing my story. Neither daughter appeared shocked. The possibility had crossed both of their minds long before the meeting. Sarah continued, "Some people believe it would finally allow me to explain everything from my perspective." She paused. Others believe it would create damage that could never be repaired. The room fell silent once again. Beatrice understood the enormous weight behind those words. Books have consequences, especially when they involve one of the world's most famous families. A single chapter can reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. One interview can reshape public opinion overnight. One sentence can permanently alter relationships built over decades. Later that afternoon, Beatrice stepped outside alone. Fresh snow crunched beneath her boots as she slowly walked along a narrow path overlooking the valley. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to think less like a daughter and more like a mother. What example would she set for her own children? Should family loyalty always come first? Or were there moments when protecting the future required saying no, even to someone you love deeply? Another recommended immediate private discussions. A third warned against any action that might appear to validate growing speculation. Every option carried risks. Doing nothing might allow misunderstandings to spread. Acting too quickly could unintentionally make the situation even bigger. As night settled once again over both London and the Austrian Alps, two very different worlds were moving toward the same unavoidable destination. One was a family searching desperately for understanding. The other was an institution trying equally hard to preserve stability. Soon, those worlds would collide, and when they did, every person involved would be forced to decide which mattered more, protecting the institution they served or protecting the people they loved. Neither choice would come without sacrifice. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the mountain lodge felt noticeably different. The tears had subsided, but the uncertainty had only deepened. None of the three women had slept particularly well. Each had spent the night replaying every conversation, every unanswered question, and every possible consequence of the decisions that still lay ahead. Outside, the first rays of sunlight reflected off the snow-covered peaks, creating an almost perfect picture of peace. Inside the lodge, however, peace remained painfully out of reach. Sarah stood alone on the terrace, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, staring across the endless white landscape. For a brief moment, she wished life could be as uncomplicated as the mountains before her. Silent, steady, and untouched by constant judgment. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Beatrice stepped outside, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've been out here a while," she said gently. Sarah accepted the cup without taking her eyes off the mountains. "I used to think difficult situations eventually solved themselves," she admitted. "And now?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Now I think they simply wait until someone is brave enough to face them." The words lingered between them. Inside the lodge, Eugenie was reading through several newspapers that had been delivered that morning. She wasn't looking for headlines about her mother. She was looking for something else. Evidence that someone had already discovered where they were. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, one short article caught her attention. It mentioned that both York sisters had unexpectedly disappeared from public engagements at exactly the same time. No accusations, no dramatic claims, just questions. Questions that would almost certainly multiply. She quietly folded the newspaper before Sarah returned. There was no point worrying her further, but deep down, Eugenie understood something had changed. Their private meeting wasn't going to remain private for much longer. Later that afternoon, the conversation shifted towards something none of them had expected. Instead of discussing interviews, memoirs, or public statements, they began talking about forgiveness. Not public forgiveness. Personal forgiveness. Sarah admitted that for years she had measured her life according to public opinion. Every favourable headline brought temporary relief. Every criticism felt deeply personal. "I've spent too much time trying to convince strangers to understand me," she confessed. "And not enough time making peace with myself." Her daughters exchanged quiet glances. Neither had ever heard their mother speak with such vulnerability. Beatrice finally reached across the table. "You don't have to prove your worth to everyone." Sarah looked down. "I know. But sometimes it's hard to remember that." The discussion gradually turned toward the future. Not the monarchy, not public appearances. Simply the future of their family. Eugenie spoke first. "No matter what happens after we leave here, we can't let this become another chapter where nobody speaks honestly." Sarah nodded immediately. "I don't want secrets anymore." Beatrice agreed. For years, everyone has protected feelings by avoiding difficult conversations. "And where has that left us?" Eugenie quietly asked. Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. By early evening, an unexpected phone call interrupted the fragile calm. Sarah's mobile vibrated across the table. She stared at the screen without moving. The caller wasn't a journalist. It wasn't a friend. It wasn't even a family member. It was someone connected to the palace. The room instantly fell silent. Sarah let the phone ring until it stopped. Seconds later, another message. Sarah slowly shook her head. Not yet. For the first time since arriving in Austria, the outside world had found them. Whatever happened next would no longer remain confined to the lodge. Hundreds of miles away, inside Buckingham Palace, the fictional king sat reviewing a briefing prepared by senior advisors. No one knew exactly what had been discussed in Austria. But everyone understood one thing. When family members begin meeting in complete secrecy, speculation inevitably follows. Some advisors recommended contacting the sisters immediately. Others argued that doing so might only confirm there was something unusual happening. The debate continued for hours. No clear solution emerged. The king listened carefully before quietly setting the papers aside. He understood that every institution depends on order. But every family depends on trust. Sometimes those two priorities move together. Sometimes they collide. This felt like one of those moments. Back in Austria, declarations. Only honesty. Sarah looked at each of her daughters. "When I sent those messages, I thought I needed you to solve my problems." She smiled softly. "I was wrong." Both sisters waited. "I needed you to remind me that I'm not facing them alone." Emotion filled the room once again, not because every problem had disappeared, but because something more important had happened. The fear that had driven Sarah into the mountains had slowly been replaced by hope. Hope that even damaged relationships could still be repaired. Hope that difficult conversations, while painful, were far healthier than silent resentment. Hope that family could survive disagreement if trust remained intact. The following morning, the three women left the lodge separately. No photographs captured their departure. No reporters waited at the gates. The mountains quietly kept their secrets. For now. As their vehicles disappeared down the winding alpine roads, each woman carried home something different. Sarah carried renewed determination. Beatrice carried unanswered questions. Eugenie carried cautious optimism. And somewhere far away, palace walls continued echoing with rumours that no one could fully confirm. Whether the family would ultimately find reconciliation remained uncertain. Whether old misunderstandings would resurface was impossible to predict. What was certain, however, was that one late-night message had accomplished something none of them expected. It forced three women to stop running from difficult conversations. It reminded them that loyalty isn't measured only by standing together during easy moments. It is tested most when love and responsibility appear to pull in opposite directions. Sometimes, the strongest families aren't the ones without conflict. They're the ones willing to face conflict before silence destroys what remains. As the snow continued falling across the Austrian mountains, the retreat slowly returned to its peaceful solitude, leaving behind only footprints that would soon disappear beneath fresh snow. But the conversations shared inside those walls would remain with each of them long after winter had ended. And if there was one lesson every member of the fictional family carried home, it was this: the hardest decisions are rarely about choosing between right and wrong. They're about choosing which relationships are worth fighting for, even when